I sat at the far end of a mahogany table in the glacier room, listening to the clink of crystal glasses. My mother was giving a glowing speech about family loyalty. Her diamond earrings caught the light as she smiled at her curated audience of 30 guests. Under my hand, hidden by a linen napkin, was a forensic report proving she was a felon. She had stolen my life savings to fund my brother's luxury lifestyle, and tonight I was going to let the police drag her out of her own birthday party in handcuffs. Before I tell you what happened when the doors to that private dining room swung open, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Sophia Vengeance. But only do it if you know what it feels like to be the family ATM. Tell me your age and where you are listening from in the comments. I read every single one. My name is Olivia Johnson. I am 32 years old, and I work as a logistics manager for a shipping firm in Anchorage, Alaska. For 6 years, I tracked cargo in the freezing cold, working 60-hour weeks. Every dime I made went straight into a high-yield savings account for a remote cedar cabin I was finally going to buy. I wanted a wood-burning stove and quiet mornings. I wanted walls that belonged entirely to me. Now let me take you back 72 hours before that dinner to the moment my reality snapped. It was a Tuesday morning. Snow was piling up against my apartment window. I opened my banking app while waiting for my coffee to brew, just doing a quick check before paying my heating bill. My thumb hovered over the glass screen. My balance, the one I had checked the night before and saw sitting at $63,412, was now $400 flat. My lungs forgot how to work. The numbers blurred together. A physical weight dropped into my stomach, cold and heavy. I refreshed the app. $400. I forced myself to breathe, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter so hard my knuckles turned white. Someone had drained 6 years of my life in a single night. I called my local credit union with fingers that would barely stop shaking. I expected the automated system, but a voice picked up immediately. It was Mr. Davis, the branch manager. He always handled my father's local car wash business accounts. When I told him my account had been wiped out, he let out a long, heavy sigh. "Olivia, please try to stay calm," he said. His voice was thick with manufactured empathy. "We are seeing a massive spike in sophisticated cyber attacks originating from overseas. It looks like a Russian syndicate compromised your routing numbers overnight." I stood frozen in my kitchen, listening to him lay out the protocol. He told me to freeze my credit, change all my passwords immediately, and wait 48 hours for their internal IT department to secure the servers. "These things take time, Olivia," he added, his tone dropping to a comforting hush. "Do not file a police report yet. It will only tangle up our internal investigation and delay getting your funds back. We will handle this quietly." I spent the next 5 hours terrified my identity was being traded on the dark web. I was running a frantic, useless maze of password resets and credit bureau calls. My hands were sweating. My heart was a drum in my ears. But something about Mr. Davis and his calm, practiced tone rubbed against my logistics training. When millions of dollars of cargo go missing, you do not wait 48 hours. You lock down the port immediately. You do not ask people to keep quiet. I was terrified, but I was also paying attention. I just did not know yet that my 48-hour wait was not a security protocol. It was a stalling tactic. The real enemy was not in Russia. She was baking a casserole 3 miles away. I hung up the phone with Mr. Davis and stood in the dead silence of my kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. The snow outside my window fell in thick, heavy sheets, burying the city of Anchorage under a blanket of white. I was supposed to wait. That was the directive from the man who controlled the vault, holding my future. Wait 48 hours for the cybersecurity team to trace the phantom Russian hackers. Wait while my $63,000 floated in digital purgatory. I paced the length of my small apartment, my chest tight with a suffocating, invisible pressure. My logistics training screamed that standing still during a crisis was financial suicide. When cargo goes missing, you hunt down the manifest. You do not sit on your hands. 30 minutes later, my cell phone vibrated violently against the granite countertop. The caller ID displayed an unregistered local number. I swiped the screen expecting the fraud department. Instead, I heard a sharp, shallow intake of breath. Olivia, do not say my name out loud. My blood ran cold. I knew that voice instantly. It was Sarah Higgins. We had been best friends since the 10th grade, surviving the brutal social hierarchy of high school and the relentless dark winters of Alaska. Sarah was now a senior teller at my exact credit union branch. She was a single mother to a 4-year-old girl and the most fiercely compliant rule follower I had ever met. She never even took an extra minute on her lunch break. Hearing her speak from a burner phone, her voice trembling with raw terror, sent a shockwave of adrenaline straight to my heart. "I need you to meet me," she whispered, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Not at your apartment, not anywhere near the bank. Go to the abandoned strip mall behind the old lumber yard on the edge of town. Park by the loading docks. Leave your cellular device locked inside your vehicle. Do not tell anyone where you are going." The line went completely dead before I could form a single question. I grabbed my heavy winter coat and shoved my feet into my boots. The drive to the edge of town was a blur of gray slush and blinding white glare. The heater in my car blasted against the windshield, but I could not stop shivering. The abandoned strip mall was a desolate wasteland of cracked asphalt and rusted metal siding. Tucked in the deep shadows of the loading dock, I spotted Sarah's battered blue sedan. The engine was idling, and thick white exhaust plumed into the freezing afternoon air. I parked a dozen yards away, locked my phone in the glove compartment, and sprinted across the ice. I threw open her passenger door and slid into the heated cabin. Sarah sat gripping the steering wheel. She wore her crisp navy blue bank uniform, her gold name tag catching the dim light, but her face was the color of ash. Her eyes darted wildly toward the empty street before locking onto mine. "It was not international hackers, Olivia," she said immediately, her voice barely a breath. "Davis is lying to your face. He is manufacturing a crisis to buy time." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the accusation. "What do you mean he is buying time? Where is my savings?" "Sarah." She reached into her heavy wool coat and pulled out her personal smartphone. "My hands are shaking too violently to hold this," she muttered, pressing the device into my palms. "Just watch the screen." I locked myself in the server closet during my 15-minute break and recorded the security monitor feed. If corporate discovers I bypassed the firewall to capture this footage, I will lose my career. I will face federal prosecution, but I know how many double shifts you worked in that freezing shipping yard. I know you sacrificed everything for that cabin. I could not sit quietly and let them bury you. I looked down at the glowing screen. The video was a grainy black and white feed from the main lobby cameras time-stamped yesterday afternoon at exactly 2:14. A woman approached window number 3. Even through the distorted security pixels, her posture was entirely unmistakable. It was my mother, Patricia. She was wearing the expensive cream-colored cashmere scarf I had gifted her last Christmas. The sheer audacity of wearing my gift while destroying my life made my stomach violently turn. I watched my mother smile warmly at the teller. I watched her perfectly manicured hand reach into her designer leather handbag and extract a single sheet of paper. She slid it smoothly under the bulletproof glass partition. "What exactly am I looking at?" I whispered, the panic rising hot and fast in my throat. "That is a typed authorization letter," Sarah replied, her voice thick with disgust. It dictates the immediate transfer of $63,000 from your individual high-yield savings into a joint checking account controlled by your parents. But I never authorized a transfer, I argued, my voice rising. They verify signatures. Any movement over $10,000 requires a secondary manager override. How did she bypass the automated fraud alert? Watch the left side of the screen, Sarah instructed, tapping the glass to rewind the video. 20 seconds. I watched the footage play backward, then forward again. This time, I focused on the customer writing desk near the entrance. My mother was standing there with an old high school tax return laid flat on the counter. Beside it was the typed transfer letter. She was holding a pen, darting her eyes between the two documents. She was meticulously practicing my signature. My own mother, the woman who hosted charity galas and preached about morality, was forging my digital identity in broad daylight. But the absolute betrayal deepened when I looked closer at the paper she handed the teller. Even in the low-resolution video, I could clearly see the distinct thick header and the faint geometric emblem pressed directly into the center of the page. It was yellow watermarked legal stationery. A sickening jolt of recognition hit my chest. That was the custom premium paper my father Richard ordered explicitly for his car wash business. He always boasted that utilizing expensive watermarked paper made his struggling local company appear like a massive corporate empire. My mother had not just forged my name in a moment of panic. She had typed the fraudulent wire transfer from the back office of my father's business. They had conspired together. They had planned this execution perfectly. But this still makes no logical sense. I pleaded, looking away from the sickening video. The forgery was incredibly sloppy. She executed it standing at a public desk. The automated signature scanner should have flagged the inconsistent pen pressure instantly. The system should have locked my account the second the mismatch registered. The automated system did flag it, Sarah said, her tone dropping to a dark, serious register. The teller received a severe mismatch warning and escalated the transaction directly to the branch manager. She brought the document straight to Mr. Davis. I stared at her through the dim light of the idling car. Why would Davis manually approve a visibly forged document? Because Davis is not just a friendly neighborhood banking manager, Sarah revealed, unleashing the most terrifying conflict yet. You know your father constantly brags about his expanding empire, right? All those flashy new car wash locations he opened last summer. It is a complete house of cards. Olivia, his commercial lines of credit are dangerously overextended. He is drowning in high-interest debt. And Mr. Davis is secretly a silent, undocumented investor in your father's latest commercial real estate venture. The silence in the vehicle became absolute. Only the violent howling of the Alaskan wind outside broke the quiet. If your father declares bankruptcy, Davis loses hundreds of thousands of dollars of his own personal retirement funds, Sarah explained, the words tumbling out in a terrified rush. Davis saw the flagged transfer alert. He recognized your mother standing at the window. He absolutely knew the signature was completely fake, but he manually bypassed the security protocol and authorized the wire transfer anyway to keep your father financially solvent. He is covering up a felony to protect his own illegal investments. The floor beneath my entire existence gave way. The Russian cyber attack narrative, the urgent instruction to freeze my credit, the strict demand that I wait 48 hours for the cybersecurity department to fix the problem. None of it was a protective measure. It was a carefully orchestrated stalling tactic. Once a wire transfer fully clears the Federal Reserve window and settles into a secondary commercial account, it becomes exponentially harder to reverse. Davis was buying the exact amount of hours my father needed for the stolen money to become legally untraceable. I was not simply fighting my deeply manipulative parents. I was fighting a highly corrupt financial bureaucracy that was actively weaponizing its power to bury me. "We have less than 2 days, Olivia," Sarah warned, grabbing my hand, her fingers like ice. "Once that internal clock runs out, Davis will permanently wipe the local server logs to cover his tracks. The security footage will be completely overwritten. The physical forged letter will be run through a shredder. Your life savings will vanish into thin air, and they will formally blame an anonymous overseas hacker." I sat back against the rigid passenger seat, the freezing reality of the situation hardening my spine into steel. My parents had cannibalized my future to save their own fragile fake empire. They had relied on my lifelong habit of being the quiet, compliant daughter who always kept the peace. They fully assumed I would simply accept the devastating loss cry about the invisible hackers and start over from zero. They were gravely mistaken. I handed Sarah her phone back. My hands were completely steady now. A new dangerous clarity had taken firm root in my chest. If my father needed $63,000 this desperately to save his failing businesses, he would have moved it directly into his commercial accounts to pay his creditors. But he had not done that. The funds had transferred to a joint checking account, a temporary staging area. I needed to know exactly where my money was going before that wire became permanent. I unlatched the car door, letting the brutal winter wind whip into the cabin. I knew exactly who in my family loved to spend money they did not earn. I just needed to check my brother's social media. I slammed the heavy car door, shutting out the howling Alaskan wind. The engine idled a low, steady rumble against the icy asphalt. My hands were finally steady. The terror of the last few hours, the frantic calls, the useless password resets, the suffocating fear of anonymous Russian hackers had crystallized into something entirely different. It had hardened into a cold, furious clarity. My parents had stolen $63,000. They had forged my signature on my father's business stationery, and the local bank manager was actively burying the felony to protect his own illegal investments. But one massive, agonizing question remained. Where did the money go? If my father, Richard, truly needed that cash to keep his struggling car wash empire afloat, he would have wired it directly to his commercial creditors. He would have paid his vendors. But Sarah had been very clear. The funds were routed to a joint personal checking account. That meant the money was not going toward his business debts. It was a staging area, a temporary holding pen for a different kind of purchase. I leaned the seat back and pulled out my secondary work phone. I opened Instagram. I did not follow my brother Tyler. I had muted his account 3 years ago to save my own sanity. Tyler was the undisputed golden child of the Johnson family. While I worked grueling 60-hour shifts managing freight logistics at the Anchorage port, he had drifted through his 20s, failing out of 2 separate state colleges and bankrupting a hipster food truck venture. My parents had always bailed him out, claiming he just needed time to find his true passion. I typed his name into the search bar. His profile loaded instantly. The most recent photo, posted less than an hour ago, felt like a physical blow to my stomach. There was Tyler standing on the polished deck of a massive, gleaming luxury fishing charter boat. It was a deep-sea vessel easily worth over $100,000 docked against the breathtaking snowy backdrop of the Homer Spit. The boat looked pristine, untouched. The caption below the image read, "Big things coming. Thanks to my amazing investors for making this lifelong dream a reality. Hard work finally pays off." My vision narrowed until the only thing I could see was the smug, triumphant smile on my brother's face. Hard work. He was standing on the physical manifestation of my 6 years of blood sweat and freezing harbor shifts. Standing right beside him in the photograph was his wife, Jessica. She wore a designer winter coat and oversized sunglasses, holding a freshly popped bottle of expensive champagne. Jessica was a woman whose entire personality revolved around projecting an illusion of immense wealth. She treated my parents like her personal ATM, constantly dropping hints about luxury vacations and high-end home renovations they simply could not afford. Now she was literally drinking to my financial ruin. But as the initial shock washed over me, the logistics manager inside my brain took control. The timeline was completely impossible. You do not purchase a luxury deep-sea charter yacht in 24 hours. You cannot walk into a marina on Monday and sail away on Tuesday. Marine financing takes weeks of underwriting surveys and intense credit checks. I switched over to the web browser on my phone. Working in the maritime shipping industry, I had immediate access to public marine registries and commercial licensing databases. I typed the registration number visible on the bow of the boat in Tyler's photo into the state port authority system. The digital records populated immediately. The vessel was registered under a newly formed limited liability company. The primary owners listed were Tyler Johnson and Richard Johnson. I pulled up the secondary financial lien records attached to the hull. The timeline laid itself out in stark, brutal detail. Tyler and my father had applied for a massive commercial marine loan 6 weeks ago. The financing had been conditionally approved based on a mandatory 20% down payment. The final closing date for the vessel transfer was yesterday, but there was a critical, glaring gap in the paperwork. The seller had filed a preliminary notice of default late last week. Suddenly, the entire sickening narrative snapped into perfect focus. Tyler had secured the massive loan using my father's failing business as collateral. But Tyler, a man who once bankrupted a food truck by spending the operating budget on a sports car, had blown the cash meant for the down payment. The financing deal was collapsing at the absolute final hour. The seller was threatening to pull the contract. My parents panicked. They were desperate to maintain the carefully constructed illusion of Tyler's newfound success. They could not endure the social humiliation of their golden child failing yet another business venture publicly. But my father was drowning in commercial debt and had zero liquid assets left to cover the massive shortfall. So they turned to the only person in the family who actually worked. They turned to the quiet, reliable daughter who had sacrificed everything to build a solitary dream. They looked at my $63,000 cabin fund and decided that Tyler's vanity project was simply more important. I scrolled down to the comment section beneath Tyler's celebratory Instagram post. The very first comment was from my Aunt Susan, my mother's fiercely protective older sister. "So incredibly proud of you, Tyler," she wrote, adding a string of champagne emojis. "Cannot wait for the inaugural family cruise next month. Your mother has not stopped crying tears of joy." I stared at the screen. The dramatic irony churning in my gut. My entire extended family was actively celebrating a future luxury vacation on a boat purchased entirely with stolen funds. They were praising Tyler's hard work while he stood on the stolen deck of my future. I was freezing in an Anchorage parking lot, fighting to reclaim the money I had earned tracking cargo pallets while my parents cannibalized my life to prop up a lie. The sheer audacity of it burned away the last remnants of my familial loyalty. They had not just made a terrible financial mistake. They had executed a coordinated, calculated theft. They assumed my silence was guaranteed. They assumed the psychological conditioning of family first would force me to accept this devastating loss. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. The engine purred. The heater blew warm air against my face, but I felt nothing but ice. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the abandoned strip mall. I was not going to wait 48 hours for Mr. Davis and his fake cybersecurity team. I was not going to cry in my apartment. I was going to call the woman who typed the forgery. I was going to force Patricia Johnson to answer the phone. I sat in the idling car, the heat blasting against my face while my blood ran entirely cold. I stared at the phone on the passenger seat, the screen dark. The digital evidence of my brother's extravagant luxury purchase burned into my retinas. The anger was no longer a frantic, chaotic panic. It was a dense, calculated rage. I picked up the device and dialed my parents' landline. The number was committed to memory, a sequence of digits that had always represented an obligation rather than a comfort. The phone rang twice before my mother, Patricia, answered. Her voice was bright, airy, and aggressively cheerful, the tone she always deployed when she was performing for an audience or trying to manipulate reality. Olivia. Sweetheart. I was just about to call you. I did not exchange pleasantries. I did not ask how her day was going. Where is my $63,000, Mom? The manufactured sweetness did not waver. In fact, it thickened, becoming cloying and deeply patronizing. Oh, honey, do not be dramatic. It is perfectly safe. Tyler had a minor hiccup with his marine financing, and your father and I just needed a temporary bridge loan to secure the vessel. We used your savings as an emergency family loan. We are all on the same team. Olivia, you have a stable job. You are fine. The sheer audacity of her words felt like a physical slap. She was not apologizing. She was categorizing felony identity theft as a casual family favor. I did not authorize a loan. I said, my voice trembling with suppressed fury. You went to my credit union. You forged my signature on my father's business stationery. You conspired with Mr. Davis to bypass federal banking security protocols. That is not a bridge loan. That is grand larceny. A sharp sigh echoed through the receiver. It was a sound I had heard my entire childhood, the universal signal that Patricia Johnson was losing her patience with my supposed difficult behavior. Olivia, we are family. Family helps family. Tyler is finally getting his life together, and you are throwing a tantrum over numbers on a screen. We will pay you back eventually. Just calm down and stop overreacting. I demand you return the funds by the end of business today. I stated every syllable sharp and deliberate. If the money is not back in my account, I will contact the authorities. A loud click sounded on the line. The heavy breathing of a second person joined the call. My father, Richard, had picked up the extension in his home office. Listen to me very carefully, Olivia. His voice barked low and dripping with authoritative menace. The immediate escalation of the conflict was palpable. You will absolutely not make a scene about this. My father was a man who ruled our household through financial intimidation and loud, aggressive bluster. He built a modest chain of local car washes and behaved as if he controlled the entire Alaskan economy. He viewed his children not as independent individuals, but as extensions of his own ego and legacy. Tyler was the heir apparent, the handsome, charismatic son who could do no wrong. I was merely the reliable backup plan, the quiet daughter whose sole purpose was to support the patriarch's vision. I am not making a scene, Dad, I replied, fighting the instinct to shrink away from his volume. I am demanding the return of my stolen property. You are threatening your own family over a temporary cash flow issue. Richard growled, his tone turning venomous. And if you think you can weaponize the police against me, you are severely mistaken. I know the senior vice presidents at your shipping firm. I play golf with the regional director. If you push this issue, if you dare try to reverse that wire transfer, I will make one phone call. You will be blacklisted from every major logistics company in Anchorage. You will never work in freight management in this state again. He was actively threatening my career to protect his crime. He was weaponizing my hard-earned professional reputation to shield my brother's vanity yacht. They believed they had me entirely cornered, relying on the deeply ingrained psychological conditioning I had endured my whole life. The threat hit a raw, vulnerable nerve, instantly triggering a visceral memory. I was 19 years old, a struggling sophomore at the University of Alaska. I was working 2 part-time jobs just to afford textbooks and basic groceries. Tyler, then 22, had just wrecked his 3rd vehicle. Richard summoned me to his office and demanded I co-sign a $2,000 high-interest auto loan for my brother. When I hesitated, Richard used the exact same aggressive intimidation tactics. He threatened to cut off my meager cell phone plan. He told me I was a selfish, ungrateful daughter. He insisted it was merely a formality and Tyler would make all the payments. I surrendered and signed the paperwork. Tyler defaulted on the very first payment and never made another. The bank aggressively pursued me. My credit score was completely obliterated for 5 agonizing years. I spent my remaining college semesters eating ramen noodles in a freezing basement apartment, unable to qualify for a decent lease, while Tyler drove around town in his shiny new truck. When I confronted my father about the ruined credit, he simply told me to stop being so dramatic and focus on my studies. It was the exact same manipulative playbook, the same gaslighting, the same profound disregard for my future. But this time, I was not a vulnerable 19-year-old student terrified of losing a cell phone plan. I was a 32-year-old logistics executive. And the stakes were not a $2,000 junk car loan. The stakes were my life savings, my independence, and the cedar cabin I had worked 60-hour weeks to secure. The internal conflict waged a violent war in my chest. Decades of toxic family conditioning screamed at me to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, to accept the loss and keep the peace. The fear of isolation, the terror of destroying my own family pushed heavily against my resolve. But then the image of Jessica popping champagne on my stolen boat flashed through my mind. The memory of my mother practicing my signature while wearing my Christmas gift burned away the remaining guilt. The bitter coldness of the Anchorage winter seemed to seep directly into my bones, freezing the last drops of daughterly obedience. "I am not making a scene, Dad," I whispered, the words slipping through my teeth like shards of ice. "I am making a police report." I ended the call before he could utter another threat. My hands were violently shaking, but my mind was terrifyingly clear. I had drawn the line. There was no going back to the quiet, compliant daughter they expected. The bridge was burned, but I knew exactly what they would do next. They would not wait for the authorities to arrive. They would launch a massive preemptive strike to control the narrative. They would rally the entire extended family to crush my resolve before I could file official charges. I needed to move faster than their lies. I needed a lawyer who specialized in financial fraud, and I needed to force the bank to turn over that forged document before Mr. Davis could destroy the evidence. I sat in the freezing cabin of my car, the echo of my father's threat ringing in my ears. He was going to weaponize my hard-earned professional reputation to protect his crime. He was going to blacklist me from the logistics industry entirely. I knew in that exact moment that I was severely outmatched. You cannot fight a corrupt financial institution and a manipulative patriarch with just righteous anger and a sense of betrayal. You need a weapon. You need someone who understands how to dismantle a house of cards from the inside out. I drove straight back to my apartment and walked into my bedroom. I reached into the back of my closet, pulling down an old winter boot. Tucked deep inside the lining was a small fireproof envelope. I opened it and pulled out a single pristine credit card. It was a high-limit account I had quietly opened years ago, right after my credit score had finally recovered from the devastating auto loan my father had forced upon me. I had kept this account entirely segregated from any banking system my parents knew about. I never used it. It was my financial panic room built for the exact day I needed to escape my family. That day had officially arrived. I spent the next hour researching corporate fraud attorneys in Anchorage. I bypassed the family law practitioners and the general litigators. I was looking for a predator. I found a man named Marcus Thorne. His firm specialized in white-collar crime and corporate financial malfeasance. I called his office, demanded an emergency consultation, and drove straight to his high-rise building downtown. The law office was a fortress of glass and dark mahogany overlooking the frozen Cook Inlet. Marcus sat behind a massive desk, projecting an aura of absolute ruthless competence. He did not offer me platitudes. He did not tell me how sorry he was that my parents had betrayed me. He simply asked for the evidence. I laid everything out on his desk. I explained the drained savings account, the forged yellow watermark stationery, the security footage my best friend Sarah had captured, and the impossible timeline of my brother's luxury charter boat purchase. Then I told him about Mr. Davis, the branch manager who manually bypassed the security protocols and demanded I wait 2 days for a phantom cybersecurity investigation. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a silver pen against his chin. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "Your local branch manager is incredibly arrogant," Marcus said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "But arrogance makes people sloppy. Davis assumes you are going to play by his rules and fight him at the local level. He assumes you will file a complaint with his desk, giving him the authority to bury it. We are not going to do that. We are going to blindside him. We are going to drop a bomb directly on the corporate executive suite." Marcus did not waste a single second. While I sat in his office, he drafted a brutal multi-page preservation demand and a notice of intent to subpoena. But he did not address it to the local branch in Anchorage. He sent it directly via priority courier and encrypted email to the credit union's Supreme Corporate General Counsel in Seattle. The legal document was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. Marcus cited specific federal banking regulations regarding wire fraud, identity theft, and internal managerial corruption. He explicitly named Mr. Davis as a co-conspirator in a felony financial crime. He demanded the immediate preservation of all security footage, server logs, and physical documents related to my account. He made it crystal clear that if corporate did not instantly seize control of the Anchorage branch, they would be held completely liable for facilitating grand larceny and subjected to devastating federal regulatory scrutiny. Federal regulators are the ultimate boogeyman for any financial institution. The corporate panic was instantaneous and spectacular. Within 2 hours of Marcus sending the demand, my cell phone began to vibrate on the glass coffee table in his office. The caller ID displayed the local credit union branch. I did not answer. Over the next 60 minutes, Mr. Davis called my number exactly 6 times. He left a string of voicemails that documented his rapid descent into absolute sheer terror. I played the messages out loud for Marcus to hear. The first voicemail was an attempt to maintain his false authority. "Olivia, this is Davis. I see you have involved outside legal counsel. That is highly unnecessary and will only complicate the return of your funds. Please call me back so we can sort this out privately." By the third voicemail, the authoritative tone had completely cracked. "Olivia, you need to pick up the phone right now. Corporate just locked me out of the main server. They are sending an auditing team. You do not understand what you are doing. Please, we can fix this without the lawyers." The 6th and final voicemail was nothing but unadulterated desperation. His voice was pitching upward, breathless and frantic. "Olivia, I am begging you, do not do this. You are ruining my life. I was just trying to help your father. Please answer the phone." Marcus simply laughed and deleted the messages. Davis had lost control of his own bank. Corporate had panicked exactly as predicted. Fearing a massive federal lawsuit, the executives in Seattle remotely locked down the Anchorage branch computers. They seized the physical forged document, the yellow watermarked paper my mother had slid across the counter. They also discovered Sarah's internal employee file, which Davis had flagged for termination. Realizing they were about to fire a whistleblower during an active fraud investigation, corporate instantly reversed the decision. Sarah's suspension was lifted immediately. Her career was completely protected. But Marcus was not finished. While corporate was seizing the bank records, he launched a deep financial dive into my father's local empire. He needed to understand exactly why a seasoned branch manager would risk federal prison to authorize a sloppy forgery. The answer arrived the next morning, hidden within the public registry of limited liability companies. Marcus called me back into his office and slid a thick manila folder across his desk. The depth of the corruption was staggering. "Your father's car wash business is completely financially underwater," Marcus explained, pointing to a spreadsheet of commercial liens. "He is bleeding cash every single month." But the bank's underwriters kept renewing his credit lines. I dug into the holding company that owns the physical land under those car washes. "Your father is the primary owner, but he has a silent, undocumented partner holding a 30% stake." Marcus tapped the name at the bottom of the registry. It was Davis. The pieces clicked together with sickening precision. Davis had quietly funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars of his own personal retirement funds into my father's failing commercial real estate venture. If my brother Tyler defaulted on his marine financing, my father would have been forced to liquidate assets to save him. That liquidation would have instantly triggered a total default on the car wash properties. The entire house of cards would have collapsed. Davis was not being a friendly neighborhood manager. Davis was protecting his own secret illegal investments. He saw the flagged forgery and realized my mother was stealing my clean money to plug the massive hole in their sinking ship. He enabled the theft of my life savings simply to prevent his own financial ruin. 12 hours later, the final nail was hammered into the coffin. Corporate had handed the yellow watermark document directly to the Anchorage Police Department. The detectives immediately ran the letter through their forensic laboratory, comparing the signature to my authenticated driver's license. Marcus forwarded me the official police report. I sat in my apartment reading the certified document. The forensic handwriting analysis was conclusive. The pen pressure was entirely inconsistent. The slant of the vowels was too steep. The loops were artificially drawn. It was a 100% confirmed felony forgery. A wave of profound, overwhelming relief washed over my entire body. For days I had been carrying the suffocating weight of my family's psychological warfare. I had been terrified that I was overreacting, that I was a terrible daughter, that I was somehow responsible for destroying the peace. But sitting in my quiet living room looking at the official police seal, I finally understood the truth. I was not crazy. I was not ungrateful. I was the victim of a documented, provable crime. The legal machinery was finally turning, and no amount of gaslighting could stop it. But I also knew my parents. They were cornered, desperate animals. They were not going to wait quietly for the police to knock on their door with arrest warrants. They were going to launch a massive, coordinated, preemptive strike. They were going to rally the entire extended family and try to burn my reputation to the ground before the truth could ever see the light of day. The psychological war was just beginning. The official police report sat on my kitchen table, a beacon of irrefutable truth in a house rapidly filling with shadows. I finally had the confirmation I needed. The financial institution had folded. The corrupt managers was exposed, and the authorities were formally investigating my mother for felony forgery. But I deeply understood the brutal mechanics of my family dynamic. Patricia and Richard Johnson were cornered. They were not going to quietly surrender to the impending legal consequences. They were going to unleash a psychological firestorm intended to burn my reputation to ash before the truth could ever catch up. By Friday morning, their preemptive strike detonated. My phone transformed into a toxic wasteland of constant notifications. My parents had constructed a masterful alternate reality and fed it to our massive extended family. They spun a tragic narrative portraying me as the villain. According to Patricia, I had explicitly promised to invest my savings into Tyler's brilliant new charter business. I had supposedly backed out at the absolute last minute out of pure spiteful jealousy, leaving the golden child stranded. To make matters worse in their fabricated story, I was now inventing malicious legal threats because I could not handle seeing my brother succeed. It was a textbook execution of gaslighting designed to isolate and destroy me, and the flying monkeys immediately swarmed. The first attack came from Aunt Susan, my mother's older sister and fiercest loyalist. Susan was a woman who thrived on family drama and held my parents up as the ultimate standard of success. She left a blistering 3-minute voicemail that I listened to while standing over my sink. "You selfish brat!" Her voice screeched through the speaker, dripping with unadulterated venom. "Your mother has been sobbing inconsolably for 2 straight days. How dare you threaten to sue your own flesh and blood? You are deliberately trying to ruin your brother's livelihood because you are miserable and alone. You owe your parents everything, Olivia. They raised you. If you push this any further, you are dead to this entire family." Before I could even process Susan's vitriol, my cousin Mark texted me a lengthy paragraph accusing me of being a sociopath who worshipped money over loyalty. Then came emails from my uncles, each one echoing the exact same rehearsed sentiment. They demanded I drop my imaginary lawsuit, immediately apologize to Tyler, and honor my supposed financial commitment. I was fighting a war on 30 different fronts against people who blindly worship the matriarch's narrative. The profound isolation threatened to crush my resolve. For 32 years, I had been conditioned to prioritize the collective peace of the Johnson family above my own personal boundaries. The sheer volume of their hatred was designed to trigger that exact conditioning, forcing me to retreat into my quiet, compliant shell. I picked up my phone intending to type a furious response to Aunt Susan defending myself against the monstrous lies, but I stopped my thumbs hovering over the glass screen. The dramatic irony of the situation suddenly washed over me, sickening and deeply absurd. While Aunt Susan and Cousin Mark were busy bombarding me with hate mail, they were simultaneously celebrating the spoils of my stolen future. I logged onto Facebook from a separate browser and scrolled through their public feeds. Jessica, my brother's deeply entitled wife, was posting a continuous stream of passive-aggressive cryptic quotes. Removing toxic, jealous energy from our lives, she wrote over an image of a serene ocean. God always protects the righteous. Right below Jessica's post, Aunt Susan had commented updating the entire extended family on their upcoming luxury vacation. "Cannot wait to sip champagne on the family first charter next month," she boasted. So incredibly proud of Tyler for building this empire from the ground up. They were bragging about upcoming VIP excursions on a deep-sea yacht that was purchased with felony funds. They were praising the hard work of a man whose business was a fraudulent shell. They were blindly defending a matriarch who was actively being investigated by the Anchorage Police Department. They were celebrating a luxury vessel that federal authorities were currently preparing to physically seize. The absurdity of their misplaced loyalty snapped my focus back to reality. I looked away from the toxic social media feeds and stared down at the legal pad resting on my coffee table. It was the same pad I used to track complex shipping manifests and cargo logistics at the port. Numbers do not have feelings. Invoices do not care about Aunt Susan's misinformed opinions. A forensic handwriting analysis confirming grand larceny is not affected by Cousin Mark's angry text messages. I realized that engaging in a defensive shouting match with 30 brainwashed relatives would only feed their narrative. They wanted me to look erratic. They wanted me to sound unstable. They needed me to scream so they could point and claim I was exactly the jealous sociopath Patricia had described. I was not going to give them the satisfaction. I placed my phone face down on the table, muting all notifications. Let them talk. Let them construct their fragile glass houses built entirely on my stolen foundation. Let them pack their bags for a luxury cruise that would never actually set sail. The psychological warfare was excruciating, but it had fundamentally backfired. Instead of breaking my spirit, the smear campaign had finally severed the last remaining emotional tethers I held to the Johnson family name. The guilt was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculated patience. But the isolation was about to break. While my parents focused all their energy on controlling the extended family narrative, they completely failed to control the golden child himself. Tyler, accustomed to moving through life without consequence, was about to make a catastrophic error. He was about to publicly reveal the true terrifying motive behind the entire criminal conspiracy, and he was going to do it on camera. The silence of my apartment felt different now. It was no longer the suffocating isolation of the past few days. It was the calm, steady quiet of a predator waiting for the prey to make a fatal mistake. The smear campaign had failed to break me, and I knew the sheer effort of maintaining their aggressive facade was draining my parents' resources. But while Patricia and Richard were busy spinning their web of lies across the extended family, they had completely forgotten to muzzle the weakest link in their entire operation. That link was Jessica. My brother Tyler's wife had never possessed the strategic discipline required to maintain a massive conspiracy. She was fueled entirely by external validation and the desperate need to project an image of effortless wealth. She lived her life for the social media algorithm, completely oblivious to the real-world consequences of her digital footprint. On Saturday afternoon, as the winter sun dipped below the jagged Alaskan mountains, casting long, icy shadows across the city, Jessica uploaded a new video to TikTok. I was sitting on my couch reviewing Marcus's legal strategy when the notification popped up on my secondary burner account. I tapped the screen. The video opened with Jessica standing on the polished teak deck of the family first charter boat holding a massive cup of expensive coffee. She was wearing designer sunglasses and an oversized fur-trimmed coat, looking exasperated. "You guys," she sighed directly into the camera, pitching her voice to sound exhausted. Outfitting a luxury deep-sea yacht is literally the most stressful thing ever. The custom marine upholstery is taking forever to arrive. And do not even get me started on the price of premium teak deck chairs. Seriously, the hidden costs of being a maritime entrepreneur are insane. Send wine. The video ended with a slow panning shot of the pristine Alaskan harbor, specifically framing the massive gleaming hull of the vessel. I stared at the video, the anger bubbling up from a deep dark well inside my chest. She was literally complaining about the minor inconveniences of decorating a stolen boat. She was performing stress for an audience of strangers while I was fighting federal bank managers to reclaim the money I had earned freezing on the shipping docks. The urge to disrupt her curated fantasy was overwhelming. It was reckless and completely against Marcus's advice to remain silent, but the sheer audacity of her performance demanded a response. I did not want to yell. I did not want to argue. I just wanted to puncture the balloon. I opened the comment section below her video. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second before I typed. "Did you use the $63,000 my mother stole from my savings account to buy those premium teak deck chairs I hit send?" I set the phone down and waited. I knew the algorithm. I knew her notifications were turned on. I knew she checked her engagement metrics every 5 minutes. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely predictable. Less than 2 minutes after my comment posted, my primary cell phone began to vibrate violently across the glass coffee table. The caller ID flashed Tyler's name in bright, aggressive letters. I did not answer immediately. I walked into my home office, opened the top drawer of my desk, and pulled out the secondary secure phone Marcus had advised me to purchase. I quickly booted up the internal audio recording software, making sure the red light was steadily blinking. I picked up my primary phone and answered on the 4th ring, swiping the screen with a calm, deliberate motion. I placed the device on speakerphone, resting it gently next to the recording device. "Take that comment down right now, you absolute psycho!" Tyler screamed. His voice was raw, unhinged, and completely stripped of his usual golden boy charm. He was not performing the confident entrepreneur anymore. He sounded like a cornered animal trapped in a very small cage. I did not raise my voice. I leaned back in my office chair, the leather creaking slightly. "Which comment, Tyler?" "Which?" I asked, the tone perfectly smooth and dangerously even. "The one asking how you financed the luxury deck chairs on a boat you could not afford to buy on Monday." "You know exactly what you are doing," he yelled, his breath hitching with sheer panic. "You are trying to destroy my reputation because you are a jealous, miserable... Take it down, Olivia." If the Federal Maritime Board sees that comment, they could pull my commercial charter licensing. "If your commercial licensing is legitimate, Tyler, you have absolutely nothing to worry about," I replied, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. "But we both know the financing on that boat was collapsing. We both know Mom forged my signature to secure the down payment." "I do not care what Mom did to get the cash," he roared, the desperation completely fracturing his control. "You know Dad is getting audited by the feds. If we did not put that clean liquid cash directly into the Marine LLC, the IRS was going to freeze every single asset attached to his name. The car washes are done, Olivia. They are completely underwater. It is our only startup capital. We had to move the money." The world stopped spinning. The air in my office grew instantly freezing cold. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on the blinking red light of the recording device. The entire landscape of the conflict shifted in a single terrifying heartbeat. The ground beneath my feet was no longer a simple family dispute over a stolen bank account. It was a massive, cavernous sinkhole of federal crime. The $63,000 was never just a desperate temporary loan to buy Tyler a fancy toy. It was a calculated illegal maneuver. Richard was facing a massive, devastating audit from the Internal Revenue Service for unpaid commercial taxes. He knew the federal government was preparing to freeze his bank accounts, seize his failing car washes, and liquidate his assets. He was drowning. He needed to hide capital immediately, but he could not use his own dirty money. Any funds tied to his name would be instantly flagged and seized by the federal auditors. He needed clean, untraceable liquid cash. He needed a pristine asset completely disconnected from his failing corporate empire. They stole my clean, hard-earned savings to launder it. They funneled my money directly into Tyler's pristine, newly formed Marine Limited Liability Company. By converting the stolen cash into a physical deep-sea vessel registered under a separate corporate entity, they successfully created a massive tangible asset that the IRS could not immediately touch or legally seize. They were not just entitled, manipulative parents trying to protect their favorite son from a minor financial embarrassment. They were actively running a coordinated criminal conspiracy to defraud the federal government, and they had used my life savings as the primary vehicle for their money laundering operation. The last shred of my daughterly guilt, the tiny persistent voice that whispered, "Family first," completely evaporated. It was burned away by the sheer magnitude of their betrayal. They had not just stolen my future. They had attempted to make me an unwitting accomplice to a federal tax evasion scheme. Tyler was still screaming through the speakerphone, his voice echoing in the silent room. "You are going to ruin everything, Olivia. You are going to send Dad to federal prison over a stupid cabin fund. Take the comment down." I reached forward and pressed the stop button on the recording device, carefully saving the audio file to a secure, encrypted cloud server. "I am not taking anything down, Tyler," I whispered, my voice colder than the Alaskan winter outside. "I am sending this recording directly to Marcus." I hung up the phone. I did not wait for his response. I knew the panic on his end of the line was absolute. He had just confessed to a federal crime on an open line. But I also knew my father. Richard was not a man who retreated when cornered. He was a man who escalated. When he realized Tyler had exposed the money laundering operation, he would not wait for the lawyers or the police. He would come for me directly. He would try to stop the investigation using whatever brutal methods he had left. The psychological war was officially over. The physical confrontation was about to begin. The Alaskan winter does not simply arrive. It invades. By Friday night, a massive glacial blizzard hammered the city of Anchorage. The wind shrieked off the frozen inlet, battering the structural siding of my apartment building with a relentless ferocity that rattled the heavy windows in their frames. I sat in my darkened living room wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the dense snow completely obliterate the glow of the streetlights. The audio file of my brother accidentally confessing to federal tax evasion was securely locked in multiple encrypted cloud servers. Marcus, my brilliant fraud attorney, had immediately forwarded the recording directly to Detective Miller. The dominoes we had carefully stacked were actively falling. At exactly midnight, the sharp mechanical buzz of the lobby intercom pierced the quiet apartment. No one visits at midnight during a sub-zero whiteout. My pulse immediately spiked. I walked slowly to the entry console and activated the security monitor. The grainy night vision camera displayed a solitary figure standing in the exterior vestibule. He was huddled against the heavy reinforced glass doors covered in a thick layer of accumulating snow. It was my father, Richard Johnson. A man who normally projected an aura of invincible corporate authority looked drastically diminished. He was missing his custom-tailored overcoat, wearing only a hastily zipped nylon parka over a wrinkled dress shirt. His posture, typically rigid and commanding, was stooped. The arrogant patriarch who had confidently threatened to destroy my logistics career just a few days ago was entirely gone. In his place stood a desperate aging man actively watching his fraudulent empire burn to the ground. I grabbed my keys, pulled a heavy insulated jacket over my pajamas, and walked down the 3 flights of stairs to the lobby. The icy concrete stairwell echoed sharply with every footstep. I approached the secure glass entryway, but I did not turn the brass deadbolt right away. I stared at him through the thick frosted pane. He saw my silhouette and immediately pressed his bare palms against the freezing glass.
"Olivia!"
he shouted, his voice muffled by the howling gale outside.
"Please open the door. I need to speak with you right now."
I slowly disengaged the primary lock and cracked the heavy door just enough to hear him clearly, leaving the steel security chain firmly attached. The frigid air rushed inside, immediately biting at my exposed skin. "What are you doing here, Dad?" I asked, my tone completely devoid of any warmth. He shivered violently, his breath pluming in thick white clouds against the darkness. The bank completely turned against me today. Olivia. Corporate executives froze every single commercial account tied to the car washes this afternoon. Detective Miller arrived at my main office with a federal warrant. They seized my hard drives. They locked down the escrow accounts. Everything is paralyzed. I stared at him, feeling absolutely nothing. Marcus and the authorities had executed the strike perfectly. Mr. Davis. The corrupt branch manager had obviously surrendered every piece of internal evidence to save his own skin. My father was bleeding out financially, and the legal sharks were already circling. He reached into his trembling pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. He shoved it desperately through the narrow gap in the doorway. It was a crumpled, handwritten promissory note. The blue ink was slightly smeared from the melting snow.
I will pay you back,
he pleaded, his eyes wide and frantic.
I swear to God, Olivia, I will give you $3,000 a month. I will sign whatever binding contract your lawyer wants. Just please call the police and tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. Tell them you authorized the transfer verbally. You have to drop the felony forgery charges against your mother.
I looked down at the pathetic crumpled paper. $3,000 a month. It would take nearly 2 years to return my stolen life savings, assuming a man facing federal tax evasion charges could even make the scheduled payments. It was a completely insulting offer.
I cannot do that, Dad,
I said, my voice echoing sharply in the icy stairwell. The forensic evidence already confirmed the forgery. Tyler openly confessed to the money laundering scheme on a recorded line.
It is entirely out of my hands now.
She will not survive a prison sentence, Olivia, he begged, gripping the edge of the freezing metal door frame. She is 60 years old. The stress will literally kill her. You cannot send your own mother to a federal penitentiary. The IRS is breathing down my neck. They are auditing 5 years of corporate tax returns. If she goes down, everything collapses. I studied his face intently. His lips were blue, and his jaw was clenching uncontrollably. He was vibrating with an intense kinetic energy. But looking closely into his panicked eyes, I realized a profound, undeniable truth. He was not shivering from the sub-zero temperatures. He was shivering from the sheer terror of losing his precious assets. He was not standing in a blizzard at midnight because he loved Patricia. He did not care about her emotional well-being or her physical survival in a penitentiary. He cared about his co-conspirator. If my mother faced a severe felony conviction, she would inevitably cut a plea deal with the federal prosecutors. To save herself, she would testify against him. She would eagerly hand over every single dirty ledger, every hidden offshore account, every secret real estate transaction. He was not trying to save his wife. He was desperately trying to plug the leak that would inevitably sink his entire life. You did not care if I survived when you drained my account to zero, I stated, stepping back from the biting wind. You stole 6 years of my life. You used my clean money to hide your dirty assets from the federal government.
We were desperate,
he argued, trying to push the heavy door wider. You threatened my career, Dad. I shot back, my anger finally rising to match the howling storm. You told me you would call the executives at my shipping firm and have me blacklisted. You tried to starve me into submission so Tyler could play pretend on a luxury yacht. His pathetic facade immediately vanished. The desperate father routine shattered entirely, revealing the vicious narcissist underneath. His face contorted with sudden violent rage. He slammed his fist against the reinforced glass.
You are destroying us!
He yelled, his true nature roaring to the surface.
You are tearing this entire family apart over a stupid cabin fund. You are a vindictive, ungrateful child. I looked at the man who had tormented me my entire life. The man who had ruined my credit at 19 and tried to steal my future at 32.
He was nothing but a fragile bully standing in the cold. No, I replied softly, my voice perfectly calm against the raging blizzard. I am not destroying anything. You set the warehouse on fire. I am just reading the final inventory. I pulled the heavy glass door completely shut, locking the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. I turned my back on him and walked slowly up the concrete stairs. He pounded on the glass behind me, shouting words the storm quickly swallowed, but I did not look back. He was powerless. The legal machine was moving far too fast for him to stop. But the ultimate battle was not quite over. Tomorrow was Saturday. Tomorrow was Patricia Johnson's highly anticipated 60th birthday. She had spent months planning an opulent dinner party at the most expensive seafood restaurant in Anchorage. 30 extended family members were scheduled to attend, the exact same relatives who had spent the entire week bombarding me with hate mail. They were expecting a grand celebration of their fake empire. I was going to give them a public reckoning they would never forget. The blizzard had broken by dawn, leaving Anchorage buried under 2 feet of pristine, blinding white snow. I stood by my living room window, holding a mug of black coffee, watching the heavy municipal snowplows scrape the frozen asphalt below. The violent midnight confrontation with my father felt like a distant fever dream. Richard had tried to shatter my resolve using sheer intimidation, but he had only succeeded in forging it into iron. Today was Saturday. Today was the 60th birthday of Patricia Johnson. For months, my mother had meticulously orchestrated a lavish celebration at the Glacier Room. It was the most exclusive seafood restaurant in the city, a place where local politicians and wealthy oil executives dined overlooking the frozen harbor. She had reserved the private mahogany dining suite for 30 guests. It was designed to be her ultimate crowning social achievement, a grand stage to parade her manufactured perfection. My cell phone vibrated on the kitchen island. I picked it up, half expecting another panicked message from my brother. It was a text from Patricia. It read simply and cheerfully, "Dinner is at 7 sharp tonight, Olivia. Wear something elegant. We are doing family portraits before the first course. Cannot wait to celebrate together." I stared at the illuminated screen, the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her words temporarily paralyzing my cognitive functions. She knew I possessed the forensic bank report. She knew Tyler had accidentally confessed to federal tax evasion on a recorded line. She knew Richard had failed to bribe me in the middle of a blizzard just hours prior. Yet here she was deploying her absolute favorite psychological weapon, aggressive normalcy. Patricia firmly believed that if she simply ignored the catastrophic reality and forced everyone to play their assigned roles, the problem would miraculously disappear. She assumed the immense social pressure of a formal 30-person dinner would crush my rebellion. She calculated that I would never dare to cause a public scene in front of the exact same extended family members who had spent the entire week calling me a jealous brat. She severely miscalculated. I walked into my home office and dialed the direct line for Detective Miller. He answered on the second ring, the sound of rustling paperwork echoing in the background. "Detective," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "What is the current status of the forgery investigation?" A heavy sigh crackled through the receiver. "We have everything we need, Ms. Johnson," he replied. The district attorney reviewed the forensic handwriting analysis and the sworn statement from the corporate bank executives. The arrest warrant for Patricia Johnson was officially signed by a judge late last night. We are planning to pick her up at her primary residence first thing Monday morning. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold wooden desk. "Monday is far too late, Detective. My father is currently liquidating assets because the Internal Revenue Service is auditing his commercial accounts. They are completely terrified. They know the walls are rapidly closing in around them. If you give them 48 hours, they might attempt to flee the jurisdiction or systematically destroy secondary physical evidence." The line went completely silent as the seasoned investigator processed the new critical variable. The IRS audit was a massive complication that drastically increased their flight risk.
"Where is she right now?"
he asked, his tone shifting from bureaucratic to highly tactical.
"She is hosting a massive private dinner tonight at the Glacier Room,"
I answered, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. 30 people will be there? The exact same people she lied to about my stolen savings.
"I am attending. You should be there too."
Miller hesitated.
"Effectuating an arrest in a crowded high-end restaurant is a logistical nightmare, Ms. Johnson. We prefer highly controlled environments to minimize collateral panic. The restaurant is a controlled environment," I countered smoothly, channeling my entire professional logistics background. "They have a private room in the back with a secondary dedicated service exit. You can secure the perimeter without disrupting the main dining floor. She will be surrounded by the very people she recruited to harass me. She needs to be held accountable in the exact same arena where she tried to destroy my reputation." Another long pause stretched across the cellular network. I could hear him tapping a pen against his desk. Finally, Miller cleared his throat. "I will coordinate with the patrol supervisor to position units in the rear alleyway. Do not engage her directly until we are physically in the room." I ended the call and walked slowly into my bedroom. I opened my closet and reached for a specific garment hanger tucked far in the back. It held a beautifully tailored navy blue dress. I had originally purchased it 3 months ago, intending to wear it to the final closing appointment for my cedar cabin. It was supposed to symbolize my ultimate financial independence. My parents had stolen that specific dream, but I was not going to let them steal the armor I had bought for the occasion. I pulled the dress over my head, smoothing the high-quality fabric against my skin. I stepped into a pair of modest black heels. I walked over to my vanity mirror and opened a small velvet jewelry box. Inside rested a tiny discreet lapel microphone I had purchased from an electronics store earlier that week. Marcus had advised me that recording conversations in public spaces could be legally complex. But I was walking into a room filled with 30 hostile, brainwashed relatives. I needed a flawless insurance policy just in case the police were delayed and my family attempted a physical altercation to silence me. I carefully pinned the tiny black device to the dark seam of my collar, ensuring it was completely invisible against the navy fabric. I threaded the thin wire under my dress and plugged it directly into the secondary secure phone tucked inside my clutch purse. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was no longer the quiet, compliant daughter terrified of disappointing her overbearing parents. She was a seasoned logistics executive who had successfully dismantled a corrupt bank, navigated a brutal smear campaign, and cornered a federal criminal. The trap was meticulously set. The bait was actively waiting. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of my apartment, stepping into the freezing Alaskan evening. The drive to the restaurant felt like moving through deep water. Every passing streetlight illuminated the path to my absolute liberation. I was about to walk into the lion's den, but for the first time in my entire life, I was the one holding the torch. I handed my keys to the shivering valet outside the Glacier Room. The bitter Alaskan wind whipped my hair across my face, but the cold barely registered against my skin. I smoothed the fabric of my navy dress and walked through the heavy revolving glass doors. The transition from the freezing sub-zero streets to the opulent heated lobby was jarring. The restaurant smelled of melted butter, expensive cedar wood, and roasting garlic. Soft ambient lighting reflected off polished brass fixtures. This was the most elite dining establishment in Anchorage, a place designed specifically for the wealthy to insulate themselves from the harsh reality of the northern frontier. It was the perfect venue for my mother to stage her final masterpiece of deception. I approached the mahogany host stand. The hostess smiled warmly and asked for my reservation. I told her I was with the Johnson private party. Her smile faltered just a fraction of an inch. She gestured down a long, dimly lit hallway, pointing toward a set of heavy double oak doors at the very end. The muffled sounds of boisterous laughter and clinking crystal echoed down the corridor. I walked slowly toward the noise, feeling the tiny microphone taped to my collar brush against my skin. Every single step felt completely deliberate. I placed both hands on the brass handles and pushed the double doors wide open. The private dining suite was a nauseating sea of manufactured joy. A massive long table dominated the center of the room, draped in heavy white linen and covered in silver platters of prime rib king crab legs and towering seafood displays. 30 extended family members filled the seats. These were the exact same aunts. Uncles and cousins who had spent the entire week bombarding my phone with hateful text messages and vicious voicemails. They were currently holding expensive glasses of imported wine, throwing their heads back in exaggerated laughter. Sitting at the absolute head of the table like a monarch holding court was Patricia. My mother wore a dark emerald-tailored gown that looked brand new. A string of genuine pearls rested against her collarbone. She was radiating a sickening aura of triumphant matriarchal success. Seated immediately to her right was my brother Tyler. He was loudly bragging to Uncle David about his upcoming summer charter bookings, waving a silver oyster fork in the air to emphasize his fabricated business acumen. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me. The sound was not particularly loud, but it cut through the room like a sudden gunshot. Tyler stopped speaking mid-sentence. Uncle David lowered his wine glass. The boisterous laughter evaporated into thin air, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence that rapidly spread from the foot of the table all the way to my mother's chair. 30 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me. The hostility in the room was a living, breathing entity. Aunt Susan, who had called me a selfish brat on a recorded voicemail, sat rigidly glaring at me with open disgust. Jessica. My brother's deeply entitled wife let out a highly audible scoff and rolled her eyes sneering at my simple navy dress. I scanned the room, refusing to break eye contact with anyone who dared to look my way. The people who had blindly accepted my parents' lies without ever asking for my side of the story were now visibly squirming in their velvet chairs. The psychological war they had waged from the safety of their cell phones was suddenly standing right in front of them in the physical world. My father Richard abruptly stood up his chair, scraping harshly against the polished hardwood floor. The arrogant patriarch who had begged me for mercy in a blizzard just 20 hours prior was now trying to reassert his dominance in front of his curated audience. His face flushed a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck visibly bulged against his starched white collar. He marched toward my end of the room, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "You have a massive amount of nerve showing up here tonight, Olivia," he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper intended only for my ears. "You are not welcome in this room. You need to turn around and leave immediately before I have the management physically escort you out of the building." I stood my ground, looking up into his panicked, furious eyes. I did not shrink. I did not apologize. I reached into my small clutch purse and pulled out the physical invitation my mother had sent me. I held the heavy cardstock up to his face. "I was invited, Dad," I replied, my voice completely smooth and terrifyingly calm. Mom texted me this morning explicitly requesting my presence. I am simply honoring her birthday wish. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but a sudden movement in the shadows near the kitchen entrance caught my attention. I shifted my gaze slightly past his shoulder. Standing quietly in the dimly lit corner, wearing an unassuming black coat, was Sarah.
My best friend had used her old high school connections with the restaurant waitstaff to slip through the rear service doors completely undetected. She offered me a single imperceptible nod. Having the person who originally uncovered the bank forgery standing in the same room fortified my resolve into unbreakable steel. I stepped neatly around my father and walked toward the only empty chair remaining at the far end of the long table. It was clearly left vacant as a symbolic gesture of my exile. I pulled the chair out and sat down, folding my hands neatly in my lap. Richard stood frozen in the middle of the room, realizing that any further escalation would destroy the fragile illusion of a peaceful family gathering. He slowly returned to his seat, glaring daggers at my face. The dinner service resumed, but the atmosphere was completely shattered. The previously joyous conversation morphed into strained, unnatural whispers. The clinking of silverware sounded sharp and defensive. Waiters in crisp white shirts circled the table, pouring vintage wine and serving massive plates of roasted meat. I politely declined everything. I refused the water. I rejected the bread. I did not touch a single item provided by the people who had stolen my life savings. I simply sat perfectly still, watching my family perform their grotesque pantomime of wealth. They were chewing on prime rib purchased with fraudulent credit lines. They were toasting to a luxury marine vessel that the federal government was actively preparing to repossess. The dramatic irony was so intensely concentrated, it made the air physically heavy. I looked directly at Patricia. She was avoiding my gaze completely, desperately trying to engage Cousin Mark in a conversation about landscaping. Her hands were visibly shaking as she lifted her crystal goblet. She knew the walls were closing in, but she stubbornly refused to surrender her stage. The tension in the private suite grew entirely suffocating. The clock was rapidly ticking down to absolute zero. The police were staging in the alleyway outside, waiting for my signal. I just needed my mother to stand up and deliver her toast. I needed her to climb to the absolute peak of her towering mountain of lies before I pushed her entirely off the ledge. At exactly 45 minutes past 7, the waiters finished clearing the heavy porcelain dinner plates from the private suite. The rich scent of roasted prime rib and drawn butter lingered heavily in the warm, enclosed air. The ambient lighting dimmed slightly, signaling the transition to the final portion of the evening. Patricia reached for her crystal goblet. She picked up a heavy silver butter knife and tapped it gently against the delicate rim. The sharp ringing sound cut through the low hum of conversation, demanding immediate and absolute attention. The entire table fell completely silent, obediently turning their faces toward the head of the mahogany table. My mother stood up, smoothing the expensive emerald fabric of her tailored gown. She projected an aura of profound grace, a carefully rehearsed performance she had perfected over decades of hosting local charity galas and neighborhood association meetings. She offered a warm, benevolent smile to the 30 relatives gathered in the room. Her eyes swept across the faces of my aunts, uncles, and cousins, completely and deliberately skipping over my empty chair at the far end. "Family is the greatest investment we can ever make in this life," Patricia proclaimed, her voice rich with manufactured emotion. "It is the only true currency that matters. When Tyler came to us a few weeks ago explaining that he needed a financial boost to secure his future Richard, and I did not hesitate for a single second. We did not question the cost. We simply acted because that is what this family does. We always put blood first." Polite applause rippled around the table. Uncle David nodded approvingly, raising his glass in a silent salute. Tyler sat beside his mother, beaming with an arrogant pride, soaking in the adulation like a sponge. Jessica clapped her hands together, a smug, self-satisfied smile plastered across her meticulously contoured face. They were celebrating a massive triumph, completely ignorant of the trapdoor located directly beneath their feet.
I placed my hands flat on the table and stood up. I did not move slowly. The sudden violent scrape of my heavy wooden chair dragging against the polished hardwood floor shrieked through the dining room. The sound was abrasive and completely jarring. The polite applause died instantly. The warm, benevolent smiles vanished. 30 pairs of eyes snapped away from the glowing matriarch and locked onto me. The suffocating tension from earlier in the evening returned with a crushing weight. I reached down and picked up the thick manila folder resting beside my empty plate. I flipped the cardboard cover open. Inside sat the certified forensic handwriting analysis report and the internal fraud admission document from the credit union corporate office. I pulled the crisp white pages out and tossed them firmly onto the center of the mahogany table. The papers fanned out, sliding smoothly across the polished wood, stopping directly in front of Cousin Mark and Aunt Susan. "Speaking of incredible investments," I said, my voice slicing through the dead silence like a razor blade. "Mom, why do you not explain your most recent financial strategy to everyone? Why do you not tell Aunt Susan how you stood at a public banking counter and meticulously practiced my signature on a yellow legal pad to steal $63,000 from my savings account?" The room did not just gasp. It entirely fractured. A collective wave of pure shock slammed into the table. Aunt Susan recoiled in her velvet chair, staring at the documents as if they were venomous snakes. Uncle David dropped his napkin, his jaw falling slack. The carefully constructed facade of the Johnson family empire shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces in a single terrifying heartbeat. Tyler reacted first. The golden child, stripped of his protective armor, instantly panicked. He lunged forward, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. His face flushed a dark, violent red.
"Shut up, you liar!"
He roared, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. "Do not listen to her. She is making everything up." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my mother. Patricia looked as though the oxygen had been vacuumed directly out of her lungs. Her face went completely chalk white, draining of all color and arrogant triumph. The benevolent matriarch vanished completely, replaced by a cornered, terrified animal. She gripped the back of her chair, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the upholstery. "She is mentally unwell," Patricia shrieked, her voice pitching upward into a hysterical, frantic register. "She is sick. She has been having a massive psychological breakdown all week because she is incredibly jealous of her brother. None of this is real." While my mother screamed her desperate lies, trying to gaslight 30 people simultaneously, I watched a different revelation unfold near the center of the table. Jessica, the deeply entitled sister-in-law who had spent the entire week mocking me on social media, slowly reached out and picked up the forensic report. Jessica possessed many massive character flaws, but she was not completely illiterate. She knew how to read legal documentation. I watched her eyes scan the bold black text printed on the official police letterhead. I watched her read the specific paragraph detailing the mismatched pen pressure and the confirmed forgery. And then I watched her read the final concluding sentence summarizing the formal charges. The smug, arrogant smile that Jessica had worn for the past 3 years melted right off her face. It was replaced by a look of profound, absolute terror. Her mouth opened in a silent gasp. She dropped the paper back onto the table, her hands shaking violently. She stared at Tyler, the horrifying realization sinking into her bones. She finally understood that the luxury deep-sea yacht, the expensive champagne, the premium teak deck chairs, and her entire fabricated wealthy lifestyle were funded by stolen money. She was legally bound to a man actively involved in a massive federal crime.
The chaos in the private suite grew entirely deafening. Several uncles were demanding answers all at once. Richard was shouting over the noise, trying to regain control of the crumbling narrative. Patricia was openly sobbing, pointing at me and continuing to scream about my supposed mental illness. I stood perfectly still, anchored in the center of the storm. I did not raise my voice to match their panicked volume. I simply waited for a brief break in the screaming. "I am not lying," I said, projecting my words clearly and calmly across the massive table, "and I brought someone to confirm it. Firm." I turned my head slightly toward the heavy double oak doors leading out to the main hallway. The final act of the evening was ready to begin. The heavy double oak doors of the private dining suite swung inward with a violent, forceful motion. They hit the interior wall with a dull, resonant thud that instantly commanded the absolute attention of every single breathing soul in the room. The soft ambient jazz playing overhead seemed to evaporate completely. Standing in the threshold were two uniformed Anchorage police officers. Their dark, tactical winter gear stood in stark contrast to the opulent crystal and white linen of the restaurant. Positioned directly between them, wearing a heavy wool overcoat, was Detective Miller. He was a seasoned veteran of the Financial Crimes Division, a man who had spent 20 years untangling the messy, desperate frauds of affluent families. He possessed zero patience for white-collar entitlement. His eyes scanned the paralyzed crowd before locking directly onto the head of the mahogany table. Patricia Johnson, the detective, barked, his voice booming across the massive dining room with unwavering authority. He did not ask a question. He delivered a factual statement. The entire room froze in a state of suspended animation. The heavy silver oyster forks and crystal goblets slipped from trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the fine porcelain plates. Nobody dared to speak. The flying monkeys, who had spent the entire week aggressively defending my mother's honor, were now entirely glued to their velvet chairs, terrified by the sudden presence of actual law enforcement. I remained standing at the far end of the room, watching the scene unfold with a cold, detached satisfaction. I had promised a witness, and I had delivered the entire criminal justice system. Miller stepped fully into the private suite, the heavy tread of his boots echoing on the polished hardwood. "You are officially under arrest for felony identity theft forgery and felony wire fraud," he announced, producing a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. The words hung in the warm air, toxic and undeniable. The carefully curated illusion of the Johnson family empire shattered instantly. Patricia collapsed backward into her high-backed chair, all the artificial grace draining completely out of her body. She began to hyperventilate her chest, heaving aggressively under her expensive emerald gown. The genuine pearls around her neck trembled violently as she gasped for oxygen. "Richard, do something!" She sobbed frantically, her voice pitching into a high, hysterical screech. She reached out blindly, grabbing her husband's arm, her perfect manicured fingernails digging deep into the fabric of his custom suit jacket. "Tell them there has been a massive mistake. Tell them to stop." My father abruptly puffed out his chest, attempting to summon the domineering, arrogant energy he normally used to bully his employees and his children. Richard had spent his entire adult life operating as a big fish in a small pond, convinced his local car wash wealth made him completely untouchable. He stepped deliberately into the path of the advancing officers, attempting to physically block their access to his wife. "You cannot possibly do this here," he shouted. His face flushed a dark, dangerous red. "This is a private event. I personally know the mayor of this city. I will have your badges stripped by tomorrow morning." The uniformed officers completely ignored his pathetic display of local privilege. One officer firmly placed a hand on my father's chest and shoved him effortlessly out of the way. sending the patriarch stumbling awkwardly backward into a rolling serving cart. Silverware crashed loudly to the floor. The second officer reached Patricia, grasping her by the upper arm and yanking her forcefully to her feet. "Turn around and place your hands securely behind your back." The officer commanded, his tone entirely devoid of any sympathy. Patricia sobbed openly, tears streaming down her carefully contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. She complied, entirely broken and stripped of her matriarchal pride. The officer retrieved his restraints. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking into place echoed perfectly across the dead silence of the private dining room. The sound was absolute poetry. It was the definitive closing argument to 6 years of my financial sacrifice. I shifted my gaze away from my mother and looked directly at Aunt Susan. The woman who had fiercely defended Patricia and called me a selfish brat on a voicemail was now staring down at the forensic handwriting report I had tossed onto the center of the table. She was reading the undeniable proof of the forgery, her hand clamped tightly over her mouth in pure, unadulterated horror. She finally realized her unwavering familial loyalty had been completely weaponized by a manipulative felon. She looked up from the documents and met my eyes. The venom was entirely gone from her expression, replaced by a deep, sickening guilt. Further down the table, my brother Tyler stood entirely frozen. The golden boy was staring at the police officers with wide, unblinking eyes. He was not mourning his mother's sudden arrest. Tyler was inherently selfish, and his brain was rapidly processing his own immediate survival. He was suddenly processing the terrifying mathematical reality that the criminal investigation was fully active. He realized the federal tax auditors and the police were now rapidly converging on his marine business. His entire identity was tied to a luxury boat purchased with laundered money, and the people who orchestrated the fraud were currently being escorted out of the building. Detective Miller began reading the Miranda rights, reciting the familiar legal warning in a steady rhythmic cadence. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As they marched my mother away from the head of the table, her expensive heels dragged clumsily against the floor. They paraded her directly past the 30 extended family members she had desperately tried to impress. They marched her right past my empty chair. She did not look at me. She kept her head bowed, hiding her face in profound shame. As the heavy oak doors swung shut behind the police escort completing her humiliating exit, the atmosphere inside the room shifted violently. The primary architect of the lies was gone, leaving the rest of the accomplices entirely exposed. The shock of the arrest began to recede, and a new, far more dangerous emotion began to boil over among the remaining guests. The family members who had been deceived realized they were sitting at a table funded by grand larceny. They slowly turned their collective attention toward the 2 men who were still standing in the room. Richard and Tyler were suddenly completely surrounded by angry, betrayed relatives demanding answers. The police had removed my mother, but the true reckoning inside the glacier room was just beginning. The heavy double oak doors clicked completely shut, sealing the private dining suite and trapping the remaining 30 family members inside a suffocating vacuum of absolute devastation. The soft jazz music continued to play overhead, a cheerful, upbeat melody that felt grotesquely out of place against the backdrop of a felony arrest. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The air in the room was completely stagnant, thick with the heavy scent of roasted garlic and expensive red wine that suddenly seemed entirely nauseating. I remained standing near my empty chair at the far edge of the long mahogany table, observing the spectacular collapse of my father's curated empire. I did not run away. I did not avert my gaze. I stood my ground and watched the dominoes fall exactly as I had planned. The initial shock that had paralyzed the room slowly began to recede violently, replaced by a tidal wave of realization. The people sitting in those velvet chairs were finally processing the sheer magnitude of the situation. They were not just innocent bystanders at a dramatic dinner party. They had actively participated in a vicious smear campaign against me, based entirely on the fabrications of a woman currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser. Uncle David was the first person to break the agonizing silence. David was my father's younger brother, a retired commercial fisherman who had spent 30 years hauling crab pots in the brutal Bering Sea. He was a practical, hardened man who despised corporate posturing and valued absolute honesty above all else. He had always viewed Richard's flashy car wash business with a healthy dose of skepticism, but he had trusted his brother. That trust was now completely eradicated. David reached across the white linen tablecloth and picked up the certified forensic handwriting analysis report. He held the crisp document in his calloused hands, reading every single line with a slow, deliberate intensity. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his neck visibly corded. He lowered the paper and turned his gaze slowly toward my father.
You stole from your own daughter.
David asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated across the massive table.
You forged her name to buy a luxury boat.
Richard stood near the rolling serving cart, looking like a man who had just been violently struck by lightning. The arrogant patriarch who loved to intimidate his employees and threaten his children was completely gone. His face was entirely devoid of color. He opened his mouth to deploy his usual aggressive bluster, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He stammered frantically, searching the faces of his relatives for any sign of sympathy or support. He found absolutely none. David stepped aggressively toward his older brother.
I asked you a direct question, Richard. Did you steal her life savings to fund that ridiculous marine charter business? We were trying to protect the family assets.
Richard finally choked out, his voice pathetic and incredibly weak. The commercial accounts were facing a severe audit. We needed liquid capital to secure Tyler's future. It was a temporary solution. We were going to pay her back.
You are a pathetic coward,
David spat, tossing the forensic report directly onto my father's empty dinner plate.
You threw your own child under the bus to save your failing businesses.
You lied to every single person sitting at this table. You let us send her hateful messages while you were actively laundering stolen money.
I am entirely disgusted to share your last name.
David grabbed his heavy winter coat from the back of his chair and walked directly toward the exit, refusing to look at his brother again. His departure severed the final thread of civility in the room. The floodgates completely opened. Further down the table, a second, far more volatile confrontation erupted. Jessica had been sitting frozen, staring blindly at the expensive crystal goblet in front of her. My sister-in-law had grown up in a deeply impoverished household, and she had married my brother Tyler specifically to secure a lifestyle of effortless luxury. Her entire identity, her social media presence, her carefully curated public image was entirely dependent on the illusion of Tyler's immense wealth. The horrifying reality that her pristine life was actively funded by grand larceny finally crashed into her brain. She turned toward Tyler, her perfectly contoured face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic.
Is the federal government going to seize the boat?
She demanded, her voice shrill and piercing. Tyler, tell me they are not taking the boat right now. Tyler physically shrank away from his wife, melting down into his velvet chair like a deflated balloon. The golden boy had spent his entire life protected by our parents' wealth, completely insulated from the consequences of his own catastrophic failures. Now the protective shield was completely gone, and he was facing the terrifying wrath of the Internal Revenue Service entirely alone.
I do not know, Jess.
he mumbled, rubbing his hands frantically over his face. The commercial financing was tied to Dad's corporate accounts. If the police seize the primary bank records, the marine lenders will trigger an immediate default clause. The auditors are going to investigate everything. You told me you earned that money, Jessica shrieked, standing up so fast her chair tipped backward and crashed loudly against the hardwood floor. You told me you secured private investors. You let me brag about our success online while you were spending stolen cash. I am legally married to you, Tyler, if the federal authorities seize your assets. They're going to freeze my personal checking accounts too. You completely ruined my life. Jessica did not wait for his response. She grabbed her designer handbag and stormed away from the table, her expensive heels clicking furiously against the floor. She did not even glance at her husband as she shoved the heavy oak doors open and disappeared down the dark hallway. Tyler sat entirely alone at the massive table, utterly abandoned by the woman he had tried to impress with my stolen money. With the primary architects of the fraud completely dismantled, the remaining extended family members slowly turned their collective attention toward the far end of the room. They looked at me. The hostile glares and smug sneers from earlier in the evening were completely gone. They were replaced by a profound, sickening realization of their own brutal complicity. They had blindly believed the lies. They had participated in the psychological warfare. They had actively tried to destroy the victim to protect the criminals, the flying monkeys. Who had bombarded my cell phone with toxic text messages were suddenly suffocating under the immense weight of their guilt. They began tripping over themselves, attempting to salvage their own moral standing. Cousin Mark looked down at his shoes, refusing to make direct eye contact. Uncle Robert cleared his throat nervously, shifting his weight from side to side. And then Aunt Susan, the woman who had left the most vicious voicemails of all, slowly walked toward my end of the table. Susan looked completely devastated. Her eyes were red and her hands were trembling visibly. She had always viewed herself as the righteous moral compass of our extended family. The realization that she had been weaponized by a felon deeply fractured her self-righteous identity. She approached me, reaching her arms out in a desperate attempt to initiate a physical embrace. "Olivia, honey," she whispered, her voice cracking with thick, genuine tears. "I am so incredibly sorry. We had absolutely no idea they were lying to us. Your mother told us such a convincing story. Please forgive me." As her arms reached toward my shoulders, I did not hesitate. I took a firm, deliberate step backward, placing a solid physical boundary between us. I rejected her touch entirely. "Do not touch me," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, steady register that carried across the entire silent room. Susan froze her arms, dropping awkwardly to her sides. She looked incredibly hurt, but I felt absolutely no sympathy for her pain. "You did not know the truth because you never bothered to ask for it," I stated, staring directly into her tear-filled eyes. "You received a convenient narrative that protected your comfortable worldview, and you chose to blindly accept it. You did not call me to ask for my side of the story. You did not demand evidence. You simply picked up your phone and decided to attack me because it was easier than questioning your sister." I looked past Susan, scanning the faces of every single relative still standing in the private suite. "You all chose your narrative without seeking the actual truth," I told them, my words landing like heavy stones in the quiet room. "You wanted to celebrate the fake luxury and ignore the obvious red flags. You wanted the boat trips and the free champagne. Now you have to live with the consequences of your absolute blind loyalty. I will not absolve you of your guilt just to make you feel better tonight." I turned my back on my extended family, permanently severing the toxic emotional tethers that had bound me to them for 32 years. I reached down and picked up my empty manila folder from the mahogany table. I tucked it neatly under my arm. I looked toward the rear service doors located near the kitchen entrance. Sarah was still standing in the shadows, watching the entire spectacular reckoning unfold. Tears were streaming quietly down her cheeks, but a massive, triumphant smile illuminated her face. My best friend had risked her entire banking career to expose the truth, and she had just witnessed the absolute vindication of her bravery. I offered her a single respectful nod, communicating a depth of gratitude that required no spoken words. She nodded back, her smile widening. I walked confidently toward the heavy double oak doors, passing by my broken father and my abandoned brother without a single backward glance. I pushed the doors open and walked down the long, dimly lit corridor, leaving the ruins of the Johnson family empire entirely behind me. I retrieved my winter coat from the hostess stand and stepped out through the front revolving doors of the glacier room. The brutal Alaskan blizzard had completely passed, leaving behind a crisp, incredibly still night. The sky was an endless canopy of brilliant, piercing stars. I took a deep breath, pulling the freezing, sub-zero air directly into my lungs. The air had never tasted so remarkably clean. The psychological war was officially over, and I had won my absolute freedom. But the financial and legal devastation for my father and brother was only just beginning. The federal banking regulators, the Internal Revenue Service, and the local authorities were about to converge on their remaining assets with a ruthless mechanical efficiency. The empire was going to be completely dismantled piece by piece, and I was going to watch every single moment of it. The days following the spectacular implosion at the restaurant were a blur of aggressive legal maneuvers and rapid financial collapse. The federal authorities and local police moved with terrifying mechanical efficiency. The legal and financial dismantling of my family was incredibly swift and absolutely brutal. There was no time for them to spin new lies or manipulate the narrative. The hard documentary evidence was insurmountable, and prosecutors showed zero mercy for criminals who attempted to defraud their own children. My mother, Patricia, faced the immediate reality of a severe federal indictment. Her pristine reputation, the social currency she valued above all else, was completely obliterated overnight. Her wealthy friends stopped calling. Her charity boards quietly asked for her immediate resignation. Facing a mountain of irrefutable forensic proof and the terrifying prospect of a mandatory 5-year federal prison sentence, she completely capitulated. To avoid spending her twilight years behind bars, Patricia accepted a highly restrictive and deeply humiliating plea deal. The judge sentenced her to 3 full years of strict felony probation. She was ordered to complete 500 hours of grueling physical community service and pay full financial restitution. The arrogant matriarch, who had once hosted elite charity galas in emerald gowns, was now legally obligated to pick up garbage along the freezing Alaskan highways, wearing a bright orange safety vest. While the criminal justice system processed my mother, my attorney Marcus executed his final devastating strike against the corrupt credit union. He leveraged the undeniable gross negligence of the local branch to threaten a massive, highly publicized corporate lawsuit. He promised the executives in Seattle that he would expose their internal managerial corruption to every major news outlet in the state. The corporate legal department panicked entirely. They desperately wanted to bury the scandal and avoid federal banking regulator scrutiny. Within 72 hours, they completely caved to our demands. My entire stolen savings balance of exactly $63,412 materialized back into my secure personal checking account. The corrupt branch manager who had arrogantly told me to wait for a fake cybersecurity team faced his own immediate reckoning. Corporate security arrived at the Anchorage branch unannounced and escorted Mr. Davis out of the building carrying a small cardboard box of his personal belongings. He was quietly but permanently terminated from his lucrative position. Marcus informed me that Davis was under active investigation by federal banking regulators for facilitating the fraudulent wire transfer and hiding his illegal commercial investments. His career was permanently destroyed. The heavy dominoes continued to fall crashing directly onto my brother. Tyler had spent his entire life shielded from the consequences of his own catastrophic failures, but his protective armor was now completely gone. Without my stolen cash buffering the fraudulent marine holding company, the commercial lenders panicked. They audited the corporate paperwork and instantly triggered a catastrophic default clause. Less than 4 weeks after the disastrous birthday dinner, a professional repossession crew arrived at the icy docks on the Homer Spit. They attached thick, heavy metal towing cables to the gleaming white hull of the luxury charter boat. Tyler stood shivering on the frozen wooden pier and watched helplessly as they dragged his massive unearned asset away across the freezing gray water. His deeply entitled wife, Jessica, stood right beside him watching the repossession unfold. She did not offer him a shoulder to lean on or a single word of comfort. The moment the massive vessel disappeared around the snowy peninsula, her marriage officially evaporated. Jessica had married an illusion of effortless wealth, and the illusion had just been repossessed by a commercial bank. She drove straight to a family law attorney and filed for absolute divorce the very next morning, citing irreconcilable financial differences. She packed her designer bags and completely abandoned Tyler without a single backward glance, leaving him to face the federal authorities entirely alone. My father, Richard, faced the most devastating destruction of the entire group. The Internal Revenue Service audit systematically gutted his corporate empire. The federal agents seized his commercial properties, froze his operating capital, and exposed years of blatant systematic tax evasion. His beloved car wash business was completely liquidated to satisfy his massive government debts. He was forced into an involuntary and highly public corporate bankruptcy. The powerful, aggressive man who had boldly threatened to blacklist my logistics career was now entirely unemployable, humiliated, and drowning in inescapable federal debt. His expensive suits hung loosely on his shrinking frame as he watched his entire life vanish. I sat in my quiet, warm apartment sipping hot black coffee and watching the soft white snow fall gently outside my living room window. The frantic, chaotic noise of the past month had finally settled into a deep, profound silence. My laptop chimed with a soft notification, signaling a new incoming message. I opened my inbox and stared quietly at the screen. It was an email from Tyler. He was begging for a temporary personal loan to secure a cheap rental apartment on the far edge of town. I read his pathetic, desperate words describing his total financial ruin and his profound, absolute loneliness. I felt absolutely nothing inside my chest. I did not type a reply. I did not offer a single word of closure or pity. I simply clicked one button and permanently routed his email address to my spam folder, completely erasing his digital presence from my daily life forever. The dramatic irony of the entire situation was absolutely complete. The family that worshipped public image above all else was now the biggest cautionary tale in the city of Anchorage. They had tried to bury me to build their fake empire, but they dug their own graves instead. The legal storm washed away their entire foundation, leaving them with absolutely nothing.
While they sat in ruins, I was preparing to finally close the chapter on my past and step into a future belonging entirely to me. 6 months passed since the heavy oak doors of the private dining suite slammed shut on my former life. The chaotic legal hurricane that completely dismantled the Johnson family empire slowly faded into a quiet, absolute permanence. The justice system moves with a cold, mechanical efficiency when presented with irrefutable forensic evidence. My parents and my brother were forced to navigate a brutal reality they had spent their entire lives trying to avoid. But the universe has a remarkable way of delivering consequences with a distinctly poetic shape. The federal court system does not care if you were raised as the golden child. The judges mandated severe financial restitution, astronomical legal fees, and strict probationary oversight for my brother. Tyler had spent his 20s bankrupting hipster food trucks and playing a pretend maritime entrepreneur using stolen funds. He possessed absolutely no tangible skills, and his public reputation in Anchorage was completely incinerated. The local business community talks, and nobody wanted to hire a man directly implicated in a massive federal tax evasion and forgery conspiracy. Out of sheer unadulterated desperation, he was forced to seek manual labor just to satisfy his mandatory court payments. He submitted an application for an entry-level warehouse position. He applied at the exact same maritime shipping firm where I operate as the senior logistics executive. When the hiring manager brought me his application for final departmental approval, I did not reject it. I did not attempt to block his employment out of spite. I simply signed the authorization form and allowed the natural consequences of his actions to take full effect. Now, every single morning at exactly 4 a.m., Tyler has to arrive at the freezing commercial port. He has to swipe his employee badge under a security scanner that reports directly to my administrative domain. He spends 10 agonizing hours a day wearing a bright neon orange safety vest and steel-toed boots operating a manual forklift in the bitter sub-zero Alaskan wind. He hauls incredibly heavy wooden pallets of commercial freight across the icy concrete loading docks. Sometimes I stand by the massive floor-to-ceiling window in my heated corner office holding a warm cup of coffee, and I watch him working far below in the shipping yard. I watch him struggle against the freezing rain, his shoulders hunched against the relentless gale. He knows my office overlooks the primary loading bays. He knows I am the executive director of his entire division, but I have never once walked down to the warehouse floor to speak with him. I do not gloat. I do not offer him a single word of recognition. The absolute silence and the massive physical distance between us is the ultimate punishment. The golden boy who once mocked my grueling work ethic is now literally breaking his back to load the very cargo I manage. While Tyler navigates the freezing consequences of his entitlement, I made absolutely certain that true loyalty was heavily rewarded. When the corporate management restructuring at the local credit union became entirely too toxic, I intervened. I utilized my professional network and pulled several executive strings to secure a high-paying data analyst position for my best friend Sarah, right here at my shipping firm. She received a massive salary increase, comprehensive health benefits for her young daughter, and a beautiful office located right down the hall from mine. She never has to stand behind a bulletproof teller window or fear a corrupt bank manager ever again. She risked her entire livelihood to expose the truth, and she earned every single ounce of her new profound stability. With the toxic debris of my past finally cleared away, I was able to reclaim the future they had tried so desperately to steal. 3 months ago, I walked into a bright, sunlit real estate office located in downtown Anchorage. I sat across a large polished wooden desk from a title agent. He slid a thick stack of closing documents toward me, along with a heavy, expensive black pen. I picked up the pen and stared at the crisp white paper. I thought about my mother standing at the public banking counter frantically practicing my name on a yellow legal pad. I thought about the sloppy, desperate forgery she used to cannibalize my life. I pressed the pen against the signature line. I wrote my name with slow, deliberate, heavy strokes. The ink bled deeply into the paper, permanently, legally, and undeniably binding me to my ultimate dream. The signature was flawless. It was entirely my own. Today, I am sitting on the wide cedar porch of my remote Alaskan cabin. The property sits on 10 acres of pristine, untouched wilderness located far outside the city limits. The air out here is incredibly crisp and profoundly silent. There are no car alarms, no shrieking cell phones, no manufactured family dramas. The only sound is the gentle, rhythmic rustle of the towering evergreen pines swaying in the winter breeze. I am wrapped in a thick wool blanket holding a steaming mug of dark roast coffee. I watch the soft, pristine white snow fall steadily from the pale gray sky, completely burying the surrounding landscape in a perfect, quiet blanket. The freezing temperature bites at my cheeks, but I feel a deep, radiant warmth expanding inside my chest. Behind me, through the heavy glass sliding doors, I can see the interior of my home. The thick logs of the cabin walls glow a rich amber color under the warm ambient lighting. A cast-iron wood-burning stove radiates an intense, comforting heat across the spacious living room. It is not a massive, sprawling mansion. It is not a luxury deep-sea charter yacht. But every single wooden board, every pane of glass, every nail holding the roof together belongs entirely to me. I have not spoken a single word to Patricia, Richard, or Tyler since I walked out of the private dining suite that night. I immediately changed my phone number and blocked every known email address associated with the extended family. The flying monkeys who blindly supported the smear campaign have been permanently exiled from my existence. I do not know how my parents are navigating their federal probation or their total financial bankruptcy, and I genuinely do not care. For 32 years, I was subjected to a psychological conditioning that demanded absolute obedience under the guise of familial loyalty. I was taught that setting personal boundaries was an act of extreme selfishness. I was trained to believe that being a good daughter meant sacrificing my own stability to ensure the comfort of people who viewed me merely as a disposable resource. I completely lost my entire family during this brutal process. The realization stung deeply at first, a phantom ache for a loving dynamic that never actually existed. But as I sit here listening to the absolute silence of the Alaskan wilderness, I realize the profound magnitude of my victory. I lost a family built entirely on lies, manipulation, and grand larceny. But I kept my soul. I preserved my hard-earned independence. I protected my money. And I secured my peace. The crushing weight of their constant expectations is gone forever. I am the sole architect of my reality now. I take a slow, deep sip of the hot coffee, letting the bitter, rich flavor wash over my tongue. I look out at the snow-covered trees stretching endlessly toward the horizon. I survived the absolute worst they could possibly inflict upon me, and I built an impenetrable fortress from the wreckage. I sit comfortably by my wood-burning stove, completely surrounded by sturdy walls that I bought with a signature that no one else will ever forge again. My name is Olivia Johnson. I am 32 years old. I chose myself, and I am finally incredibly home.